Now let's create the DbContext and introduce Entity Framework into our project. I'm going to use the same models folder and add a new class that I will call World Context. Now this word context is an important one. Entity Framework uses these things called context objects as the basis of a collection of entities that it wants to store in some database. Now, often these entities are going to be related in some way, much like our stop and our trip are related to each other through that collection. A context is going to be a wrapper around a set of entities that are related to each other. You could imagine this in a large enterprise application as maybe being the employee context that has all the classes that are related to employees, and maybe another one for sales context that has all the entities that are related to sales. This is simply a class that represents the starting point for data access and data storage. In order to make this a context, we're going to derive from a class called DbContext. Now, DbContext doesn't exist yet, so I'm going to use refactoring and add the package for the Entity Framework core. Once that's been added, you can see that this is using Microsoft data.entity. That is where the Entity Framework lives in the namespace. And once we have this, we can create properties for each of the type of entities we're going to store. The data type of them is something called a dbSet. dbSet takes as a generic parameter the name of the object type, and then this will be the name of the property that exposes that data. Off of this trips property is how we're going to query for the trips in the resulting database. Let's do this again for stops. Before we can use Entity Framework, just like any of the other systems we've looked at, we need to configure it in the startup. So let's open up that startup.cs. Let's begin by configuring the services. These will be the services that Entity Framework is going to expose and then you can use. That will include things like DbContext and dbSets. We can do this by saying services.add entity framework. And since this is a Fluent syntax, I can go ahead and say add SQL Server. Now I'm not getting IntelliSense because I don't have this package yet. Let's use Control Period again, and we can see we can add the Entity Framework SQL Server package. And this is important because the core Entity Framework doesn't know about any databases, so we need to add packages to support specific databases, in this case SQL Server. That you could see eventually they're going to support a number of different data stores, relational and non-relational. But for us, we're going to stick with SQL Server. Again, this is still a Fluent syntax, so it's going to return an object that I then can call add DbContext, and here I'm going to specify the name of our context, World Context. Refactor to add the using statement. And we've now added a number of different kinds of services to the ASP.NET 5 project. We're adding all the Entity Framework specific interfaces that we may need. We're also adding any SQL Server specific pieces that we need. We're saying that's how we're going to use the Entity Framework. And then we're adding our specific DbContext object as an injectable object into other parts of our application. Now we've configured our container to work with it. Let's go ahead and use the DbContext and do something that actually works.